Across the span of centuries, lives have risen and fallen like the tide. Hands once rough with work, hearts once heavy with hope or sorrow, eyes fixed on horizons known and unknown. From quiet villages and towns to roaring seas, from courts of law to the wide, wild frontiers. Our ancestors walked roads they could not see the end of, each step carrying them further from where they began and closer to where we are now. These are the ones who crossed oceans, who braved wars and exiles, who carried names like banners through the shifting winds of history. They are gone, yet their fire remains. It burns in the veins of their descendants, in the voices that still speak their names, in the hands that build, mend, and create. This is their story and ours, woven across time, carried forward on the long breath of history to those who keep the flame. parish of Olney, Buckinghamshire, in 1775, a shoemaker's son was born. His name was Timothy Goosey. His father was Richard Goosey. According to my grandfather's notes, his father took his own life, and the verdict was lunacy, according to the parish notes. Timothy's life was a mystery to him, as he appeared to have just vanished from Buckinghamshire, and that mystery will be revealed. It was a mystery my grandfather never got to solve in his lifetime. The Gooseys were of humble stock. His father's hammer struck against the cobbler's last, stitching life into worn soles and shoes. Timothy learned the trade young, leather beneath his hands, the smell of polish, the rhythm of craft. I've taken liberties here, as I know Timothy was a trained cobbler and made a living out of it. I'm not so sure if his father was a cobbler, but it makes sense to me that it was an industry passed down from father to son. I do know that Thomas Goosey, his grandfather, was a cobbler, so it makes sense to me that the family trade and skill was passed down. The Gooseys were a family established in and around the Mears Ashby region of Northamptonshire and spread outward into surrounding areas. Originally, the name is from Oxfordshire. It's Anglo-Saxon for Goose Island. It seems that people with that surname in the family line end up getting called Goose for a nickname, and for me that has also been the case. It was an ordinary life. A small cottage, a parish church, a name already weathered by centuries of English soil. But within this boy's story, the ordinary world would soon fracture into the extraordinary. By 1807, Timothy was 32. He had a wife, Jane Feasy, and children in Sherrington, yet poverty pressed upon him. 3 infant daughters had already been carried to the grave, and so desperation tempted his hand. Timothy forged a note of hand, a false debt of £4 2 a sum equal to months of labour, but the lie was uncovered. On the 3rd of March, 1807, at the Aylesbury Quarter Sessions, he stood condemned, sentence, transportation for 7 years. His wife was left with babes upon her skirts. Timothy, the shoemaker's son, now faced exile beyond the seas, or the hangman's noose. It must have been a desperate situation for him. It would not have been easy for them raising a family in that time. But Providence or policy spared him. On the 15th of July, 1807, Timothy received a royal pardon. The price of his freedom? To don the red coat of His Majesty's 14th Regiment of Foot. From felon to soldier, his life was bought not with coin, but with blood yet spilled. The king had traded one punishment for another. But I think he was probably a strong man. At the time they needed soldiers, strong men, and in a weird sort of way he was lucky here. And this wouldn't be the last of his good luck, as we shall see. His lucky star still had more for him. Spain, 1808. Timothy's regiment was thrust into the Peninsular War, part of Britain's fight against Napoleon. Under Sir John Moore, the army advanced deep into Spain, but when the French came in overwhelming force, retreat was ordered, a retreat across mountains in the dead of winter. The march to Corunna was a crucible. Men staggered barefoot, their feet bleeding through tatters of leather. Frostbite gnawed, rations dwindled. Some froze where they fell, never to rise. Timothy, once a shoemaker, now trudged upon ruined boots of his own, stitching endurance into every step. At Corunna, January 1809, the British made their desperate stand. Amidst cannon smoke and musket fire, Moore himself fell, mortally wounded. Yet the army escaped by sea, saved at terrible cost. And Timothy, battered, weary, but unbroken returned to Britain, not in chains as a convict, but with the scars of a soldier. So once again he was lucky. He marched through the mountains where others had died. He survived. He also survived the siege of Corunna and found himself on a ship headed for his homeland. His lucky star and his wits had saved him again. By 1810, Timothy's road led west to Conwy, North Wales. There he married Blanche Hughes, beginning a second life beside the castle walls and tidal waters. But Jane, his first wife, still lived in Buckinghamshire until 1822. Whether by desertion or bigamy, Timothy had left her behind. She raised their children alone. In Conwy, Timothy reinvented himself. He opened a shoemaker's shop on Castle Street, hammering leather once more. The war was behind him. The shame of his crime was a distant echo. Here on the edge of the Irish Sea, he sought redemption through work and family. And I tried to understand why he ended up here. Why didn't he return back to Buckinghamshire? Was he wounded and dropped off at the first port to recover, apparently given the last wages for being a soldier? At that time, there was no rail network, and public transportation across the country could be dangerous. Well, it turns out that after the siege of Corunna, the 14th Regiment of Foot Infantry was stationed in the Fermor Barracks in Cork Island, and he left the army in September 1808. For whatever reason, he ended up in the beautiful port town of Conwy, with its medieval castle. He must have bought passage on a ship at Cork and sailed to Conwy, Wales. Conwy is a lovely place. In comparison to the quaint villages of Buckinghamshire, I know where I would rather live, and it would definitely be Conwy, with its beautiful scenery and coastline. He maybe didn't want to go back because of the judgment he would have faced from his peers. He left his wife raising her children alone and settled into creating a new family, and so his lucky star gave him its final gift that created one family and broke apart another. And so his story held a fracture. He must not have told his new wife that he was already married with Jane Feasy in Sherrington. Timothy had fathered Hannah, Susanna, Elizabeth, Rosetta, Sarah, James and Titus, the son through whom the Goosey line endures. With Blanche Hughes in Conwy, he fathered Titus once more, Elizabeth, Richard, Thomas and Margaret, from which a Welsh Goosey line appears. 2 households, 2 wives, 2 sets of children, a man divided, living one life in the record books of Buckinghamshire and another in the parish rolls of Conwy. One man yet 2 legacies. The mystery finally solved for my grandfather. On the 22nd of February 1844, Timothy Goosey died in Conwy, aged 69. The parish records recorded him simply shoemaker, Castle Street. But his story was far from simple. Shoemaker's son, felon, soldier, survivor, husband, father, cobbler once more. His road wound from Olney's cobbled lanes, through the icy mountains of Spain, to the sea-washed walls of Conwy. And though centuries have passed, his name endures, in the Gooseys who came after, in the soles of boots he once mended, in the stones of Conwy that still hold his shadow. This is the tale of Timothy Goosey, a tale of crime, of survival, and of second chances. And this is the story I wanted to tell for my grandfather, and any other person of the Goosey name, or any other of Timothy's descendants. A man who for in his time got to see more of the world than his peers. He raised 2 families and fought in the Napoleonic campaign to kick Napoleon out of Spain. Unlike some of his fellow soldiers, he went on to live a full life in Wales. The mystery finally solved for my granddad. I have some good family photos of my great-grandfather, Henry Goosey, and his father, Robert Goosey, from who I get my middle name. The story my granddad told me about Henry was that he was a labourer and gardener after he served in World War II. He lived in the gardener's cottage on an estate belonging to some gentry or nobility. He was eventually given that cottage, and in the immediate post-war era, his own green fingers served him well. He had bees and therefore honey, pigs and poultry. His father Robert served in World War I, and I have an amazing picture of him. He was a labourer. His wife was a lady called Alice from the Lee family of Norfolk. Their marriage was quite rocky, so my granddad said. They coexisted nonetheless. My granddad himself was also a builder and founded a building firm, Blisworth Builders, to give his two sons work and a trade to live by. He was a real character with a good practical sense of humour. He was a man that could be found whistling in tune non-stop on a building site, and also he could sing and quite fancied himself a Frank Sinatra lookalike back in the day. His paternal line and mine goes all the way back to Timothy. I could only trace it as far as an individual named Samuel Goosey, born in 1666, and it was back in the days where English was not standardized, so his name was spelt in various ways. Gossey, Goosey, Goose, Goosey. So it gets hard to trace past that. His family was around Olney, Mears Ashby and Irchester for generations. Cobblers, labourers, gardeners and soldiers. As I said before, the name means from Goose Island and is Anglo-Saxon in origin. It comes from the village of Goosey in Oxfordshire in the Vale of the White Horse. It developed not far from an abbey called Abingdon Abbey, where the monks maintained a flock of geese. So my thoughts have always been that the name has its original name, meaning geese herder or goose herder. The oldest Goosey I was able to find was Walter de Goosey or de Gossey, as listed in the Berkshire Book of Fees, 1242. No doubt if my granddad was still alive, he would correct me on a few things. If you are a Goosey, or descended from Timothy as well, and have any additional information or stories, please get in touch. When I started this film project, I didn't realise there was an artist with the surname Goosey. It turns out that the Timothy Goosey of our story was named after his own uncle. Well, from him descends an artist named George Turland Goosey, a distant cousin of mine, fourth cousin 4 times removed. Born in 1877 Northampton, he emigrated to New York to train to become an architect. He ended up designing some of the early skyscrapers, the famous Friars Club and 7 Roman Catholic churches. He went on to do some etchings and won first prize with his etching Moonlight on a Venetian Canal in the annual exhibition in New York in 1914. In 1921, he moved back to his home country and settled into the art colony in St Ives in West Cornwall. What a find for me, to think another Goosey enjoying and painting the gorgeous harbour town. All this time I visited and never knew. After a few years he returned to America and he died in 1947 at Laguna Beach, California. So he must have been very well off from his architecture and art. As a final piece for this story, I'll show you some of his great art. This story began for me as a family mystery. Working through the Ancestry website, I couldn't find who my mother's great-grandfather was on her paternal side. Then working through it slowly, it turns out there was a name change in the family, as her great-grandfather held the surname of Masterman, which would have been my mother's maiden name. It turns out half of Eleanor's sons took her maiden name, and the story goes that it was to keep the Farwell name alive. This shows how strong a character she would have been at the time in the Victorian era. In October 1862, in Melcombe Regis, Weymouth, Dorset, Eleanor Ruth Farwell came into the world. Her father, Stephen Dennis Farwell, and mother, Martha Brown Farwell, belonged to a place where the shore met the town and the sea was as familiar as the morning market. She was one of many sisters, Annie, Bessie, Kate, Martha, and brothers Joseph and Alfred John, a bustling household in a harbour town. The Farwells were not wealthy, but they were rich in sea, air, and community. Nets dried on stone walls, seagulls screamed overhead, and Eleanor grew up with salt on her lips and a horizon that was never closed. Playing with her sisters and brothers, enjoying all that life growing up by the sea can give to childhood. The Farwells were not wealthy, but they were woven into the very life of the town, where neighbours knew one another and the sea was both a friend and a fate. I have no photographs of Eleanor Ruth Farwell Masterman, yet her likeness has not been lost. Through the living thread of her family, we may glimpse her. Imagine a woman with thick dark hair, full and strong, as if it carried the soul of the sea winds. Her skin bore the warmer tones of the Farwell line, sun-kissed even in the cool Dorset air. Her eyes, keen and watchful, belonged to a harbour town child, bright with curiosity, yet steady, as though they had already measured the tides of fortune and loss. She was not a woman of fragile airs, but of strength, born of a community that worked the land and the sea. In the bustle of Weymouth's harbour, with fishing boats crowding the quay and the cries of gulls above, Eleanor would have stood out, not for aristocratic refinement, but for her earthly beauty, her vitality, and the quiet determination that would carry through a long and eventful life. In her descendants, in their strong hair, their warm skin, their lively eyes, we still see her. Eleanor lives on, as present now as she was then. I myself know the joy of growing up beside a seaside city, and later a harbour town by the sea. The sea is an ever-present fascination, sometimes friend, sometimes terrifying, but always present. In January 1887, at the age of 24, Eleanor married Arthur Job Masterman, a young man from Dorchester, slightly younger than her. They began in Weymouth, but his work would pull them inland. The children came in their turn. William Dennis Farwell in 1884, the first of her sons to carry her surname in the place of his father's. Arthur James in 1887, Frederick Job in 1889, George Henry in 1891, Alfred Edward in 1894. They lived in Dorchester in their early marriage. It's funny because before knowing any of this, when I visited Dorchester, I loved it. I still love Dorset now and feel drawn to it. It must have something to do with the family line and having ancestry there. Tragedy cut through in 1897 when Frederick died at just 8 years old. Eleanor buried her boy in Barton Regis, far from the salt water of her own childhood. The death is recorded as being in Gloucestershire. Eventually, the couple would have a total of 7 surviving children, with my great-grandfather being one of them. It would have been 8 children if poor Frederick had survived his childhood. By 1901, Arthur's work had taken them to Cobham, Surrey. For a woman born to the open harbour, the landlocked calm must have felt like exile. The air was green with hedgerows, the fields rolled on, but the sound of seagulls was gone. and with it the lull of the sound of the waves crashing on the shore. She made a home there, but the pull of the tide was still in her bones. Arthur stayed for work. She stayed for her children. But a decision was coming. I myself don't like living away from the sea either. It must be something in my bloodline related to that side of my family tree. I found out later that he was a foreman for a building firm. What the exact nature of the move or his exact work is unknown to me. He never went back to Dorset, as we shall see. At some point, Eleanor made her move, bold, decisive. She moved to Portsmouth, the great naval city, and there she stayed. Arthur remained in Surrey, later dying in Croydon in 1922. For a time, the marriage must have stretched across miles, for even after settling in Portsmouth, she had 3 more sons: Sidney Dennis in 1905, Noel Henry in 1907, and William Edward in 1909. Now she was raising the youngest boys largely on her own, in a place where the sea was always within sight, where ships came and went with the turning tide. She had brought her family back to the coast, and in doing so, she planted the Farwell name in the heart of Portsmouth's naval tradition. At some point they actually did divorce. Arthur remarried a woman called Alice, who then became Alice Masterman. He was also in the Navy in World War I, forming another naval connection. Her choice shaped the lives of her sons. William Dennis Farwell, her eldest Farwell son, joined the Royal Navy in 1898, a boy of 14 in uniform. He served before the turn of the century, married in Portsmouth in 1904, and remained tied to Hampshire for the rest of his life. He raised a large family of 10 children, some of which also became naval men. Sidney Dennis Farwell, known as Dennis, followed in 1920, serving first on HMS Impregnable and later aboard HMS Victory I. He earned the Royal Navy Long Service and Good Conduct Medal for a career that spanned from 1920 to 1944. Family remembered him for his easy pride and the thick head of hair that he never lost. He is my great-grandfather. He travelled the world of the Navy. My mum says he was a great man and a great husband and father. I have few photos of him, but the one that sticks out for me is the one at my mother's wedding, and how proud he looks of his granddaughter, with a cheeky smile in the back. He died in 1982 when I was 1 year old, so I don't remember him. Noel Henry Farwell stayed ashore but worked among the tides of dockside life. In 1939, a hotel wine cellarman and storekeeper in Portsmouth, tending to the quiet industry that kept the city's heart beating. At some point he married, and he too eventually moved to London. His death is recorded as being in Lambeth. William Edward Farwell the Younger, he was the traveller. In 1948 he sailed to Houston, Texas, crossed into Mexico, and eventually returned to Portsmouth, bringing a touch of the wider world back to the harbour city. And the Masterman sons? Arthur James Masterman, the second eldest. In 1904 he left Cobham and also joined the Navy, a Victorian Navy man who later served in World War I. He first served on the ship Boscawen I in 1904, and the last ship he served on was the Dolphin in 1920. He married and had 2 sons and a daughter, and spent the rest of his life in Portsmouth. He was some kind of consultant for the development of the naval torpedoes they used in World War II. He then lived on the rest of his life on his Navy pension. George Henry Masterman. At the age of 14, he left for Halifax in Canada from Liverpool. I wasn't able to find out why or what he went to Canada for. He came back to this country at the age of 20, married and lived in London. His occupation was a bookkeeper, or what they would call nowadays an accountant. He made his money doing that, then settled into married country life in Surrey as a poultry farmer. Alfred Edward Masterman, the youngest of the sons to carry the Masterman name. I couldn't find a great deal of records on him. He seems to have moved to Canada, also probably to be with his brother. Why these two brothers went to Canada is unknown to me. He also came back and married in Alton, Hampshire. He also lived in Surrey for a time, but after that the trail went cold. I could not find his death records, so I suspect he went back to Canada to live. So, in their own way, the brothers stayed close. The two eldest, with different surnames, both established themselves as naval men in Portsmouth. The next two brothers who followed each other to Canada. And the three youngest, who were raised in Portsmouth, although Noel went on to live in London. We see that not one of these sons stayed in Cobham. Eleanor lived through a world in motion, the close of the Victorian age, the reign of 4 monarchs, the arrival of electric light, and the great changes in women's lives. She was no famous suffragette, but she made choices that defied her time, by keeping her own name alive through her sons, and raising them in the dockyard city. She made the Farwells a Portsmouth name, and in time a family of naval men. She did find love again in her life. She married a man called Charles Beck, but it looks like she kept her surname. She was also a corset maker for a living, dressmaking as well, so she must have had a decent and steady income, a strong, adaptable woman. Eleanor Ruth Farwell Masterman died in Portsmouth in September 1939, aged 76, just weeks before the outbreak of another war. She had known loss, distance, and the hard work of raising sons without her husband beside her. Yet she made her own course, one that led from the cobbled harbour of her birth through the inland years of compromise and back to the sea she had always missed. In the gull's cry over Portsmouth, in the Farwell name, still carried by sailors and sons, in the very choice to return to the coast and claim her own lineage, her presence remains. A Dorset name, a Portsmouth name, a name anchored in salt water and carried forward by the tide. And this is the story I tell for my mother, to solve another family mystery and to tell Eleanor's story. Unfortunately, I don't have any pictures of Eleanor. I know some people have in their ancestry trees which are private. So please reach out to me if you are her descendant and have a photo of her. I would dearly love to see her face. I do, however, have photos of her sister, Martha Elizabeth Farwell Hind, and also her mother, Martha Brown Farwell. The Farwell family were known for their seafaring, going way back into the history of Dorset. This has led people to associate the name with the meaning farewell. However, knowing how important holy wells are in the southwest, I tend to agree with the name meaning farewell, which represents holy well. If you are a fellow descendant from Eleanor or Arthur and have any new information or stories or pictures, please get in touch. This story I told for my mother to solve the family mystery of the changed maiden name and my grandfather Roy. And we end with a piece of music I wrote for Eleanor that reflects the feelings of the tide and motherhood. But let's go back in time again before we end this part about Eleanor. Back to 1871, when Eleanor was living with her parents in 2 Walpole Terrace in Melcombe Regis, a Victorian terraced house. Back then, her eldest sister Martha Jr., at the age of 21, was already a dressmaker, and I can imagine Eleanor with her oldest sister making dresses for fun, and already that was giving her the basic understanding which would lead her to her own career that would keep her going throughout her life. Martha Elizabeth Hyde went on to marry William Robert Hyde, who was with his family engineers for Cozens & Co., a company that made paddle steamers based in Weymouth and took people out on Victorian pleasure cruises around the coast from Weymouth. I love this picture of the paddle steamer in Lulworth Cove. They raised a family together. Here is a picture of Martha and her daughter, Jessie Griffin Hyde, and her husband, William French Sharp. Together they had 5 children, another strong Farwell woman. Arthur was born 2nd of July 1884 in the railway and canal village of Blisworth, Northamptonshire, to Benjamin Packwood and Annie Eliza Carter. The canal boats passed quietly through, and the railway line linked the Midlands to the south. By 1891, he was a boy in a village where everyone else knew each other. By 1901, the family had moved to Olney, Buckinghamshire, but the East Midlands remained his heartland, and here we see a different Arthur in the springtime of his life, a young boy and lad, carefree in the countryside. Blisworth was a hub for the Grand Junction Canal and had a busy railway station. Rural life here revolved around farming, local crafts and market towns. Young men often worked in trades linked to transport, agriculture or the nearby boot and shoe industry. Arthur lived in Blisworth by 1911, unmarried and living with extended family, employed as a stoneman in a flour mill, a miller who grinds the grain with the millstone. In 1914, Europe was thrown into conflict. The British Army expanded rapidly, and men from every village were called to serve. Arthur joined the Royal Army Medical Corps, probably the first Northamptonshire field ambulance. His training taught him to carry wounded men under fire, manage field sanitation, and work in casualty clearing stations. The RAMC's motto was "In arduis fidelis," faithful in adversity. Territorial Force RAMC units were local in recruitment, with Northamptonshire men tending to join the 1st Northamptonshire Field Ambulance or to be posted as reinforcements to other units. Training included stretcher drill, tented hospital setup, and emergency surgery assistance. On the 12th of August 1915, Arthur landed in Egypt. The Gallipoli campaign was in full swing, and Egypt was the main evacuation point for the sick and wounded. Ships arrived daily, packed with men suffering from wounds, dysentery, typhoid, and exhaustion. Arthur luckily worked in Alexandria or Cairo, moving between casualty clearing stations, base hospitals, and convalescent depots. The Gallipoli evacuation chain. From the trenches of Gallipoli, wounded men were ferried to hospital ships. These sailed to Alexandria or Port Said, where RAMC teams unloaded them for treatment. Base hospitals in Alexandria were overwhelmed. Some housed over 1,000 patients at a time in converted schools and civic buildings. The summer heat added to the misery, with temperatures often exceeding 40 degrees Celsius. I can only imagine the horrors of war he witnessed, and the intense heat before the invention of sun cream. A fair-skinned man from Victorian England must have roasted, and what a different culture for him to have experienced. When Gallipoli ended in early 1916, Arthur's unit likely joined the Sinai and Palestine campaign, moving east to defend the Suez Canal and advance into Ottoman-held territory. The RAMC followed closely behind the fighting troops, establishing field dressing stations in desert wadis, staffing ambulance trains and running mobile hospitals. Desert warfare posed unique medical challenges: sandstorms, water shortages, heat stroke, and tropical diseases like malaria and dysentery. After nearly 6 years' service, Arthur returned home with the British War Medal and Victory Medal. In June 1922, he married Alice O'Dane Helena Goodrich in Blisworth, another sudden but positive change for him. They raised 2 children, William Arthur and Avis. Demobilisation in 1919-1920. Returning soldiers often faced long waits for discharge as the army reduced its size. Many come home to unemployment and economic uncertainty. There was no formal mental health support. Shell shock, as it was called, was still poorly understood and often stigmatised. In December 1940, Alice died suddenly, leaving Arthur a widower. I've been told his son William had some special needs, though he would later marry and have children, and he also served in World War II. His daughter Avis, only 8 at the time of her mother's death, grew up quickly, taking on household responsibilities and supporting her brother and father. Life on the home front, World War II. Even for those not in uniform, the Second World War brought rationing, blackouts, and the constant anxiety of bombing raids. Widowers like Arthur were under huge strain, especially if they had dependents. By June 1949, Arthur was 65. Decades after leaving the deserts of Egypt and Palestine, the memories of the war were still with him. In those days, there was no PTSD diagnosis and no counselling. The burden became too much. In June 1949, Arthur took his own life. It was his 17-year-old daughter Avis who found him, a moment that would leave its own deep scar. I haven't been able to tell what happened to my grandmother in between that moment and the moment she got married to my grandfather in 1953. I'm not sure if she and Bill lived in the house or whether they lived with a relative until the point she got married. Life couldn't have been easy for her growing up. Her mother died when she was 8, and her brother had some sort of special needs, although I don't know the exact details of that, and her father must have suffered with depression and PTSD symptoms. She went on, though, to live a full life, raising her own children with her husband, one of which was my father. I always remember her fondly and with love, as she sadly passed away in 2014. She was like a second mother to me and a light in my life, and I made this part of the film to honour her and tell a story that was never fully told in her lifetime. The hidden casualties of war. Many World War I veterans struggled in silence for decades, their suffering invisible to the wider public. Today, historians recognise that the war's psychological toll often claimed lives long after the fighting ended. Arthur served not with rifle and bayonet, but with stretcher and bandage. He saved lives in unbearable conditions, saw horrors few could imagine, and bore those scars silently for the rest of his life. His medals tell only part of the story. The rest is written in the quiet courage of a man who endured the worst of war, and in the family who remember him. In memory of Arthur, who crossed deserts and seas to save the wounded, who bore the weight of war yet carried it home in quiet dignity, may the poplars whisper his name in the wind, and may those he saved walk beside him in the fields of peace. Your story lives now and will not be forgotten. Beneath the poplars' whispering sway, he walks no more, yet feels the day. Fields remember the steps he knew, and keep his spirit in morning's dew. This story I tell for my grandmother, a woman of quiet dignity, with bright blue loving eyes, and someone I miss always. In spite of the way Arthur's life ended, I see her eyes in his, bright and twinkling eyes. Those same eyes I have inherited, except mine are green. for Avis Packwood. The name Packwood comes from a village called Packwood in Warwickshire. It's an occupational name, as well as having an association with early forestry. I have a picture of Alice, which I have tidied up and photoshopped. We can see how happy she was in life. She died at the age of 48. For Arthur and the children, it must have been like someone had turned off the sun itself. I could trace the Packwood name back to the early 1700s, but no further. However, an offshoot name from Arthur's line is the surname of Lazenby, which I could trace into Yorkshire back to the Elizabethan age. And so, I also honour Arthur and remember that in his lifetime he acted with bravery and saved lives. This is a song I wrote for him. Fields to Egypt's shore, with a stretcher he marched through the cannon's roar, tending the broken, the brave, the worn, far from the village where he was born. Carry him home, carry him home, the healer who never stood alone. Through shifting sands and the sun's fierce light, he worked for hope in the endless fight. A steadfast soul, both brave and kind, leaving no wounded soul behind. Carry him home, carry him home, the healer who never stood alone. He came back home to a silent street, no cheers to sound, no drums to beat. The war still raged inside his mind, to peace he sought and could not find. Carry him home, carry him home, the healer who never stood alone. Carry him home, carry him home, the healer who never stood alone. Richard Eddles was born in 1791 in Bisley, Gloucestershire, to Samuel Eddles, a man of the old parish ways, and Hester Riddler. Bisley was a hilltop weaving and farming community in the Cotswolds, surrounded by stone cottages and steep valleys. His was a working family, familiar with the weight of the plough and the cart. The turn of the century brought the Napoleonic Wars, But peace in 1815 came with a cruel irony. Wages dropped, bread prices rose, and the rural poor felt the squeeze. By his mid-20s, Richard was a carter and a waggoner, married to Elizabeth Whiting in Avening, 30th of May, 1816. They had at least one child before fate took its darker turn. Horses were wealth on four legs, tools for farm, road and war. In 1821, Richard was caught up in a charge of horse stealing. Whether driven by debt, opportunity or a tangled feud, the law was merciless. At the Gloucester City Quarter Sessions, the sentence was transportation for 14 years, death commuted to exile, a one-way passage to the far side of the world. In early 1822, Richard boarded the Shipley, bound for New South Wales. 4 months of cramped quarters, salt air and ship's biscuits carried him into a strange new land. Upon arrival, he was assigned as a government waggoner. The very skills of his English rural life now pressed into colonial service. The colony was young, its roads little more than dirt tracks, its farms carved from the bush. Men like Richard hauled timber, supplies and grain through unforgiving heat. By 1828, he was based near Botany and had earned a ticket of leave, allowing him to work and live within a set district. But freedom is a fragile gift. In 1829, his ticket was cancelled after a dispute with a Mr. William Merritt over the hide of a heifer, a reminder of the convict stain and the fine line between legitimate trade and accusation. The Colonial Secretary's correspondence shows his name tangled in official letters, and soon after he was connected to the Australian Agricultural Company in the Port Stephens, Stroud area, a sprawling operation of sheep runs, stockyards and pioneer settlements. At Stroud, Richard found a rhythm of labour and survival. The work was relentless, clearing land, tending stock, building roads and mills. The AA.Co. settlements were small, tight-knit, and every hand was known. In 1835, he finally received his certificate of freedom. No more a prisoner, but a free man in a new country. From then on, the colonial press shows him trading mares at Maitland markets, advertising lost stock, and generally moving in a world as a smallholder and horseman. The man once transported for horse theft had built an honest trade from the same animals. By the 1850s, Richard was a fixture of the Stroud district. Old Dick he was called, and known to all. He had weathered the long exile, the labour and the suspicion, and had made a modest life. By 1859 he died at Stroud, aged 68. The local obituary marked his passing without scandal. Just the end of a long colonial life. Back in Gloucestershire, the hills of Bisley would never know he had made peace with the land at the far edge of the earth. From the green folds of the Cotswolds to the ochre roads of New South Wales, Richard Eddles carried his life in his hands, and in the reins of the horses he knew so well. In Bisley, his skill as a waggoner had been a way to earn his bread. In the colony, it became the compass by which he navigated a foreign world. He hauled timber and grain over bush tracks, broke in horses that had never known a bridle, and bartered stock at noisy markets where the dust rose like smoke. He mended wheels, knew which creeks would run in summer, and he could read the weather by the colour of the horizon. 14 years of servitude could have broken a lesser man, but for Richard, they were the forge in which his resolve was tempered. By the time he was free, he was no longer the youth who had stood in the Gloucester dock. He was a colonial horseman, known and trusted in Stroud, his name spoken without the shadow of scandal. When he died in 1859, the Stroud district lost more than a neighbour. It lost a man whose hands had helped shape its roads, fields and herds. Back in Gloucestershire, no one marked his passing, but in Australia, the horses grazed in the paddocks he'd cleared, The wagons rolled on the routes he had cut, and the name Eddles lived on, in blood, in memory, in the quiet endurance of those who came after. What happened to Richard seemed to affect his grandson psychologically, as Henry Eddles had some kind of wanderlust. Born in Eastcombe, near Bisley, in Gloucestershire, he started his life there, did his carpentry apprenticeship, and seemed to move around a bit. First he went to live in Rugby in Warwickshire, then he ended up in Devon, marrying the love of his life, Caroline Mudge. They married in Newton Abbot, and most of their children were born in the Torbay area. He did some sort of work on ships around the area, and this had a great effect on his son, James Henry Mudge Eddles, known as Harry or Henry, giving his son a lifelong love of the sea. For some reason, he and Caroline decided to move to Saxilby in Lincolnshire, where he was still working as a carpenter at 71, dying at the age of 81. Why the move? Who knows? Caroline herself, the once girl from Devon, died at the great age of 92 in Gainsborough, Lincolnshire in 1944. The Mudge name passed down through the generations as a middle name. It's a name that goes deep into Devonshire, that branches off with the Tozer surname, and it also connects to Cornwall too. As for Harry, great-grandson of Richard, well, he was a lifelong naval man. His love of the sea led him eventually to Portsmouth, where he first served on HMS Asia and last served on HMS Victory too. He was well established in the Navy and worked his way up to Chief Stoker, the chief petty officer responsible for the ship's engines and machinery. He came out of retirement to help with the war effort during World War I. His long career meant he was able to buy his own house and raise a family there with his wife Hettie Raynor, or Hettie Eddles as she was known. He worked on many ships, and together he and Hettie raised a daughter called Ivy, my great-grandmother. After they lost their first child shortly after childbirth, she was called Hettie too. She married Harry in 1900. I can only guess they met in London, as she was from Mile End and lived around the Whitechapel region. My grandfather Roy told my mother that she was quite strict and that he was scared of Nanny Eddles when he was a child. Her father was William Raynor, a fisherman in London, and her mother was Kate McCarthy, a lady born in Cork Island. Her father, Dennis McCarthy, had escaped the Irish famine with a few of his children to London, while his wife, Ellen Sullivan, went to New York with a few other children. They ended up in the Victorian poorhouse, which is where I think she met William. Dennis died young, sadly, at the age of 46, but Kate and William raised a family of 7, with Kate dying at 58. Hettie must have kept her mother's religion, as she was baptized a Catholic, and her daughter kept to that faith also. Ivy was an interesting individual. She was a herbalist and a spiritual healer, using healing hands, a gift that would be passed to me, which started my journey in Reiki. She understood palmistry and could read tea leaves. She also had the Mudge name as a middle name, Ivy Doris Mudge Eddles. She could also play the piano and sing. She and her husband, Sidney Dennis Farwell, raised 2 sons, and she taught my grandfather how to play piano on an upright piano, starting his lifelong love of music. And I have this picture of when me and my grandfather jammed to some 12-bar blues music together. It's from her I get my musical instincts. She and her husband stayed in the house she inherited from Hettie and Harry. I would have loved to have met her. She died in 1978 in her own home in Portsmouth, and the funeral was a Catholic one. The Eddles name has changed over the years. It was Idols, meaning religious idols, and then it changed to Eddles, and then Eddles. And now, to finish, we'll listen to a song I wrote for Richard. I may as well have washed ashore, leaving everything behind, my children just a distant memory, my marriage just a dream. summer in me grows, teaching me the way of this land as the ships come and go. I decide to stay here. In the last part of the film, I spoke of how Caroline Mudge was from deep Devonshire stock and lived to the grand age of 92. Well, her mother's maiden name was Tozer, a family that goes deep into the Torbay area. Eventually, that splits off into Jasper and Langdon, and that's where the story connects to Cornwall, the county that I've been living in for over 20 years and a place dear to me. I was searching for my family tree to see if there was any Cornish ancestry, and not only did I find it on my mother's side, I also found it on my father's side. Well, this part follows the story from the Langdons to the Sturtridges to the Pomrey family of St Neot, Cornwall. In the spring of 1584, in the quiet uplands of St Neot, Cornwall, a girl was born into the Pomrey family. She was christened Jenne, though her name would have been written in parish records as Joan, Jen, or Jenny, or even Joan, for spelling was an unsettled thing in her time. Her world was that of late Elizabethan England, the air tense with rumours of Spanish war, yet full of the confidence of an island nation that had stood its ground. In the west, Penzance folk still spoke of the Spanish raid of 1595, and every coastal village knew the fear of ships appearing over the horizon. The Pomreys were rooted in Cornwall's soil, descended from the Pomeroy family of Tregony and Berry Pomeroy, an old Norman family going back to when William the Conqueror granted them land in the southwest for one night's good service. Pomrey was a corruption of that name, and perhaps they were minor nobility in St Neot, or farmers or merchants tied to the land and the rhythm of the seasons. St Neot's granite church and Holywell anchored the community. Life was small, and that smallness was safety. On the 27th of April, 1590, in St Neot's church, a marriage was solemnized between Jenne Pomrey and David Sturtridge, a man whose name points eastwards across the River Tamar to Devon. Marriage to David would see them both settled in the village of St Neot, though David would keep his links to Braunton. I'm not sure what he did for a living, but my guess is that he was some sort of merchant. They raised their children here and had them baptised in the church in St Neot and the church in Warligan. I wondered why St Neot, a place that skirts just south of Bodmin Moor, a place that once held the relics of a saint of the same name until they moved his bones to a town called St Neots in Cambridgeshire. Well, I found out what would have been significant. It would have been a pilgrimage shrine, but also back then it was on the main road going west or east to Liskeard, before the road through the Glyn Valley was built. In 1608, the daughter of Jenne and David, Joan Sturtridge, was born. She entered the world in a kingdom newly under James I, when hope for religious tolerance was fading and Puritan unrest simmered. By the time Joan was a child, talk of far-off lands was already buzzing in West Country ports. Ships from Plymouth and Dartmouth sailed to Virginia and Newfoundland. In 1620, the Mayflower departed from Plymouth. Its passenger's story would become legend. Joan grew up between two cultural tides, the old ways of her mother's Cornwall and the restless maritime spirit of Devon. Somewhere along the way, she met John Langdon of Braunton, a man whose life, like hers, would be caught up in the great movement of peoples across the Atlantic. So Joan then became Joan Langdon. The couple travelled around a bit. She unfortunately gave birth to a stillborn in Brixham named Anne Langdon. Later she gave birth to another child and called her Anne, in honour of her stillborn sister, and from that Anne Langdon I descend. She was also born in Brixham, so that tells me that at some point the family must have moved there. The decades rolled on. Jenne Pomrey lived through plague years, poor harvests, and the rising storm of politics. By the early 1640s, the country was at war with itself. Cornwall backed the king, Devon was split, and Plymouth endured a long siege by royalist forces. For ordinary people, the Civil War brought scarcity, danger on the roads, and a deep uncertainty about the future. In 1646, the war ended in the West Country. Plymouth reopened to the sea, and with peace came ships bound for a very different kind of future. Joan and John married in Warlegan, Cornwall, and the fate of the family was now set. In July 1646, Joan was still in Braunton or Brixham. Within a year or two, she and John Langdon, with children already, booked passage from Plymouth or maybe Brixham. The ship's name is lost to us, but it would have been a small merchant vessel of 80 to 150 tons, carrying perhaps a few hundred souls. They sailed west for 8 to 10 weeks, cramped in a hold that smelled of salt, pitch and humanity. The ship pitched through storms and lay becalmed under hot skies. Nights were lit by lanterns swaying in the dark. The Atlantic was both barrier and promise. Their daughter Anne did not travel with them. She married William Jasper in 1645 at the age of 20 in Churston Ferrers in Devon. In 1656, Susanna Jasper was born. She, like her mother, was born in Brixham. She is my 9 times great-grandmother. She married Edward Tozer in 1684 in Churston Ferrers. At this point in time, whatever Cornish descent there was in the family had well and truly established itself in Devon. Plymouth, 1647. The quay is wet from morning rain. Crates and barrels are stacked beside coils of rope. Joan stands with her husband, the wind whipping her cloak. Behind her, the low hills of Devon roll away to the east. Ahead, the grey Atlantic swells. She thinks of her mother, Jenne, in Cornwall, older now, still walking the lanes of St. Neot, and wonders if they will meet again. When the gangplank is drawn up, the sound of gulls fades under the creak of timbers, and the shouted orders of the crew, England recedes. This is the song I wrote for them, a song for the parted. A simple song for the sons and daughters, for the ones that are left behind, as their parents sail into waters, only ashes drift in the mind. Hold on to the light that still remains. Love is never lost at sea. Finds its way in hearts of us, though only memories remain. And a song for the mothers and fathers who watched their children disappear, left with echoes, prayers and silence. Every shadow hides a tear. Hold on to the light that still remains. Love is never lost at sea. It finds its way in the hearts of us, though only memories remain. By the 3rd of April 1649, Joan was in Boston, Massachusetts, where she gave birth to her son, John Hugh Langdon. The town was still young, timber houses clustered around meeting houses, muddy streets, and a deep Puritan rhythm to life. The Massachusetts Bay Colony was a place of opportunity, but also of strict rules and harsh winters. Joan lived long in Boston, surviving her husband John by 3 years and outliving many of her children. She died in 1700, aged 92, a living link between Elizabethan Cornwall and the New England of Cotton Mather and Salem. Jenne Pomrey lived and died in the Old World, never knowing the forests and winters of Massachusetts. Johan Sturtridge crossed into the New World and lived to see it grow from scattered settlements to thriving colonies. One carried the Cornish name, the granite churchyard, and the old lanes in her memory. The other carried those same memories across the sea, planting them in alien soil. Mother and daughter, one rooted, one wandering. And so, a strange connection again. The Mudge family were a family that lived in the small village of Bury Pomeroy for generations, and just down the road, the Pomeroy family had their castle, and I somehow am descended from both. Bury Pomeroy Castle is said to be one of the most haunted castles in Britain, yet I felt totally at peace there. I wonder if that is why. And so, the strange Cornish connection from my grandma Avis in Northamptonshire to my 5 times great-grandfather Jasper. Jasper Millwood was born in Phillack, a quiet hamlet crouched against the Cornish coast near Gwithian, where the dunes glow gold in the late sun and the gulls wheel above St. Ives Bay. The Millwoods had tilled and traded in that soil for generations, their lives braided with the Andrew Arthurs and further back still, tied by a faint thread to the noble family of Courtenays. Yet Jasper was restless. Perhaps the sea wind carried in him a yearning that could not be stilled. He turned his back on the shining sands and set his course for London, a choice no record can explain, though one imagines the law of work and the city's din of opportunity. At 21, he married Mary Collett and bent his craft to the cobbler's bench, shaping leather into shoes for other wanderers. Their daughter, Mary Millwood, carried the family into new country. She wed William Wilkins in Gloucestershire and made her home in the Cotswolds, where the hills rolled gentle as folded cloth. Her life was brief, only 39 years, and she was laid to rest in Stow-on-the-Wold. But her story did not end there. Her daughter Anne, born in Warwickshire, married William Goodrich, and with him raised a family. One of their children, Richard Goodrich, would grow to become my grandmother's grandfather. By then, part of a line settled in the village of Blisworth, Northamptonshire. The thread wound onward. Richard's granddaughter, Avis Packwood, married Stanley Goosey, my grandfather. The name she bore is unusual, Avis, yet it carries an echo from centuries before. Records tell of an Avis Adam, born in 1530 in Liskeard, Cornwall, and so it seems the name itself made the long journey, like a hidden relic passed down through blood and memory. In the end, the family's travels from Cornish shore to London streets, through Cotswold hills and Warwickshire fields and across Northamptonshire lanes, circled back to where it began. I live now in Cornwall once again, not far from Jasper's birthplace, an hour and a half drive west. It feels as though the tide of centuries has turned, carrying the family back to the coast where the story first opened to the sea. And Hale Sands is truly beautiful. I always felt a connection there, and now at least I know why. This is the story I tell for my niece and nephew, Ollie and Orla, who may one day watch this film to learn about their Cornish ancestors. Every family carries its own rhythm. For my mother's line, it begins with a man who loved clocks. My great-grandfather, Arnold Leonard Robert Hallett, was born in Andover in 1900, a child of Hampshire brick and rail. His father, Robert Hallett, worked first as a bricklayer and later as a Victorian railway porter. His mother, Florence Mary Ball, came from brewing stock. Her father worked the slow alchemy of malt and yeast, a craft that turned patience into livelihood. Arnold came of age as the world was being remade by machines of air and steel. At 19, he joined the Royal Air Force, carrying with him a surname whose Anglo-Norman roots meant Little Hero. Through 2 world wars, he lived by the measure of dials and minutes, a man who understood that time could be both master and companion. He kept time close to his heart, as if each tick held a story of its own. In 1946, after years marked by loss and change, Arnold found a new partner, Betsy Ann Grundy. She was small in stature, strong in will, with a dry humour that could steady any storm. Her roots ran deep through Lincolnshire and Northamptonshire. Her father, George Grundy, earned his living as a painter, most likely a painter and decorator. Her grandfather, Burgess Grundy, was a tailor who worked by hand and lamplight, and her mother, Beatrice Bamford, came from Raunds, a Northamptonshire market town whose honeyed limestone buildings catch the sun much like those of the Cotswolds. The Bamfords had been part of Raunds for generations. I have a cherished photograph of my great-great-grandmother Beatrice, remembered as kind, steady and unshakably good-natured. Through her, the line stretches back to the Bamfords of old, Thomas, Elizabeth, John, country folks whose lives are woven into the hum of a small town, the rhythm of work and rest. The men of the Bamford line were known for their prominent eyebrows, a distinguishing mark that curiously skipped me. I have almost none to speak of. And beyond them the thread continues, all the way to Anna Banks, born in 1570. Her daughter Susan Lovell married and crossed the sea to America, while another daughter, Elizabeth Nichols, stayed behind through marriage, keeping the family rooted here. It's a story that mirrors that of Jenne Pomrey, whose descendants too were scattered and settled across oceans and fields. That is as far back as the thread can be traced, into the late days of Elizabethan England. But ancestry is more than trades and names. It is the echo of spirit, of song. My grandfather Roy Farwell played piano. My grandmother Audrey Hallett sang. When they met, music bound them together, and from that duet a new voice was born. That voice, carried through blood and breath, is mine. I was never close to my grandmother, but when I knew her in her later years, she carried a sense of having aged ahead of her time. I often wonder what her singing voice sounded like, what notes she might have left hanging in the air. Stone, steam, malt, cloth, paint, and time, all these threads converging into music, the story of my mother's line carried forward in song. Over the last 5 years, I've followed these stories back 3 centuries, tracing faces, footsteps, and forgotten corners. I began this project out of curiosity, but what I found was understanding that history lives quietly in us, waiting to be remembered. Why did I make this film? For the future, so these tales won't be lost to those who come after, to my family, to the many descendants of those named here. Perhaps one day my niece and nephew will see it and remember where they came from. The tree of life has many branches, yet it is still one tree. What I've learned is that people were never static. They moved for work, for love, for hope. We like to think migration is a modern tale, but movement has always been part of who we are. Each story holds 2 sides. Like a coin caught mid-turn, a life can hang in that space between staying and leaving, between past and future. That's how I came to Cornwall myself, following invisible lines that drew me home to the coast. The world, too, keeps turning like a great clock. It may not always feel like it's turning the right way, but I have faith, not in institutions, but in the quiet courage of good people making good choices. The tree still stands. The clock has not yet struck midnight. To anyone descended from those whose names appear here, if you have stories, memories, or fragments to share, please reach out to me. Thank you for watching this film. its roots deep